So good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is it loud enough? And thank you for being here. To speak personally for myself, I find it really wonderful to meditate together in a group. It's a different kind of there's a different, I don't know exactly the right word to use, but a different kind of grounding, a different kind of settledness that when the group of people sit together. And of course that can be quite wonderful for sometimes, and it could also be difficult because it also highlights maybe how restless the mind is or how much, impatience there might be. And, ordinarily we wouldn't see that so clearly because we might just get up and turn the TV on or do something to distract us, go eat or something. But here, kind of like maybe because you're with other people, there's a little bit more care to keep the container, to keep stay within it, and then it gets clear. Oh, I'm really impatient, or wow, this mind of mine is out of control. I can't wait until this is over. Surely they must have slept through the bell. And so we get to see what the mind does, and that it's really one of the gifts of meditation is to see ourselves clearly, both at what is wonderful but also what is challenging for us, so we can really see it honestly and clearly and find a way to work through it. And the topic I want to talk about today is the imagination. And the way I was kind of brought up in Buddhism, first in Zen and also in Vipassana, we were kind of like the anti-imagination people. Because imagination, we're like the just seeing things as they are people. Like just see things as they are directly, the direct experience of what is. And imagination is a way of losing touch with how things are directly. It's like superimposing some ideas, a projection of some fantasy or something on a situation that distorts it in some way. And at least that's the way that I came into this tradition, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for how much it pulled the rug from underneath, or clarified how much fantasy I lived in, which was plenty, and how much I projected artificially, constructs on top of the others, the world, and also on top of myself. There's so many ways in which I imagined who I was, or imagined who I shouldn't be, or measured myself against some imaginary idea of what a person's going to be. And so the imagination played a big role in having this kind of practice that constantly pointed that out, that don't go there, was actually very helpful for me. But it also limits our full humanity. That imagination is important and part of human life. It's so important that it's probably unimaginable without it. I think we're always imagining somehow, even if you're, you go out for a walk on a cloudy day, and you imagine what it would be like if it rained. It might rain. That's kind of imagination. And so you take an umbrella. If you hadn't that kind of idea of imagination, maybe you wouldn't have gotten the umbrella or something. I don't know if that was a good example, but it was my attempt. So it turns out that in the teachings of the Buddha, there's a lot of different teachings about imagination. However, the English translators often don't translate it that way. One of the words that I like to translate as imagination, they might translate it as conceives. And conceives, I don't know what imagination that evokes for you, but conceives feels to me a little more conceptual, like you have a concept you create. What's delightful about conceives is it has this connotation that you're inventing something, you're bringing something into birth, conceiving something maybe that is a fantasy, doesn't really exist. But and then there's also words that sometimes translated as one regards. Regards. What does that mean? But the Pali word has the word see or visualize in it, samanupasati, and so. But the way it's used, if you see, it kind of used like to visualize or imagine. So here's a Buddha's use of imagination. I'll give you an example. And it's supposed to evoke your imagination in a way that makes a point that maybe inspires you, maybe gets you to think about something in a different way, and maybe points to something in yourself or in human nature that is better kind of conveyed through an act of imagination than it is to tell you this in prose, just like matter-of-fact way. So this comes from the Buddha. I'll paraphrase it, so at least in the time of the Buddha, there was a great God in the heavenly realms named Brahma. And Brahma was kind of like the ruler of all the gods of his realm. And he had a great palace, majestic in the sky somewhere. And he had a majestic, august throne. Only person who's supposed to sit on that throne is Brahma himself. Well, one day Brahma was off in some other parts of the heavenly realms, doing what Brahma does. And there was a little ugly little runt of a troll. Not that they had trolls in ancient India, but the Indian word is Pali is yakka. Those of you who know Sanskrit, yaksha. So, he came into the palace and came into the royal court or divine court and jumped up on that throne. And this you don't do. And so the other gods in the court started telling that, you shouldn't be up there. That's only for Brahma. Please get down. And he wouldn't get down. So a common thing to do in something so important as not being adhered to is to get angry. And so the voices went up and the other gods said, you have to get down, you must get down. And the more angry they were and the more stern they were and offensive they were, the more that ugly little yaksha got bigger and bigger and more beautiful until he was sitting there huge and big and radiant and beautiful on the throne. Well, this confused the court gods to no end, so they went looking for Brahma and explained what was going on. And Brahma said, I know what's happening. So in a snap of his finger, because he's a god, he returned to his palace. And he stood in front of his own throne, and he bowed deeply to the yaksha and said, nice to see you. We haven't seen each other for a long time. And you're quite beautiful, big, and I hope you're comfortable up there, and is there anything I can do for you? And as he kind of treated him that way, kindly, generously, with kind of hospitality at his own place, this yaksha started to shrink and get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally, poof, he vanished. So then the great god Brahma sat up back on his throne and explained to everyone in the court, this ugly little runt of a troll is an anger-eating troll. So if you come with anger, he'll eat it. It nourishes him, and he grows and becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. But if you don't offer anger, then you're not nourishing this challenging thing, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So that's a story. So it's it's a fable. Maybe it happened back then, but to tell that story is evokes the act of imagination for the audience. And I think for some of us, it's kind of evocative. Like, what does this mean? Like, you can imagine it and all that, and imagine these people angry and this person getting bigger, and it's kind of a fable for careful what you do with your anger. Because some of who you are, some of the challenging parts of you, if you are angry, something grows in you. And probably none of you have an angry little runt of a troll inside of you. But you have something in there. And sometimes anger is self-fulfilling. We get angry, and we get angry at ourselves, and we feel awful and bad, and then we kind of get more angry and more blame and upset. And so this idea that there's something that thrives in anger, but that diminishes and vanishes in kindness, is, I think, it's a wonderful little story. And it's a story that I've taught to children. I've been invited to elementary schools to teach kids, like just say something Buddhist or something, and I've told that story. And so yeah, that's a kind of a use of imagination, harnessing it for the purposes of making some point. And the Buddha is full of things like that. And he uses them also for purposes of supporting people's meditation practice. He encouraged people to use their imagination, their memory, to recollect things that inspired them. So there was an inspiration of gladness, of joy, of delight that's associated with meditation practice. And you don't want to overdo it. If sometimes you're kind of supposed to be miserable in meditation, but not you're supposed to make yourself that way. but we're supposed to kind of really meet ourselves as we are. And some people are experts at running away and trying to avoid and fix and not face what's going on. But can we face really the difficulties and our challenges and unresolved issues? Can we face them with a way that's inspired? That we're glad to look at our impatience. Even though I'm restless and I want to bolt from meditation, wow, is it some way that I can feel, okay, this is difficult, but I'm inspired, I want to do this. And so the Buddha encouraged people to call on their imagination for that purpose. So, for example, to imagine your own virtue. And if you have enough virtue that makes you inspired, oh yeah, I'm basically a good person. I haven't killed anyone lately, and I haven't robbed any banks lately. It's pretty good. Unfortunately for this world, it's pretty good because, so much bad stuff happens. Or think about someone else's virtue that that really inspires you. Think about something that makes you happy. I know that I've sometimes been in meditation and struggled, and then there's been someone else on the retreat who sat so well. You just felt their kind of simple, almost selfless dedication just to be there and practice all the time in a nice way. And wow, okay, well, if that person can do it, I think I'll stay here. And so I have my eyes closed. Oh, remember that person? Sit there. Okay, keep going. That's an act of the imagination of sorts. And then so there's challenges called the 5 hindrances, the 5 obstacles for meditation, of preoccupation with or addiction to things like sensual desire, ill will, freezing or becoming really stiff or closed down, inertia, restlessness, and doubt. And so meditators have to work with this. The Buddha gave one set of similes to describe what it's like to, to have these. Another set of similes for what it's like to not have them. And here he's using the imagination to give people maybe a palpable, visceral sense, feeling, for what it's like when these aren't here. So we can recognize their absence. So we can kind of look at the little opening in our hearts that kind of show us, well, this is the way, not to be caught by these things. So so freedom from addiction, preoccupation with sensual desire, is visualized, and he uses the word visualize here. A person who has paid off a business loan when the business has prospered and who can now support their family. Isn't that nice? So I don't know if any of you have really been struggling under debt. I don't know what sensual desire, addiction to it is like, how it's a debt exactly, but the freedom from that, now I don't have this heaviness, this preoccupation, this concern, this constant nagging that I have to kind of pay the debt back. And freedom, and again the word freedom is an word that evokes something in the imagination. Freedom from ill will is visualized as a person who is ill, suffering, terribly sick, with no appetite and weak in body, who recovers and regains their appetite and bodily strength. Some of you have probably been really sick, and finally when you're well, and the first time you can leave your house, and wow, I'm still weak, but boy, is it good to be in the fresh air, and kind of it's delightful. Finally, we've relieved of ill will. We carried the resentment for years and years. People carry resentment for a lifetime. But then to find it finally lifts, oh, wow, it's like that illness is gone. I hope I have now some immunity. Freedom from this kind of inertia, stiffness, usually called sloth and torpor, but kind of resistance, is as a person is freed from prison and bondage without any loss to their wealth. Kind of, so when we're stuck in some kind of heavy, burden weighing down kind of mental state, it's kind of like being in prison. So the freedom from prison. Freedom from restlessness or agitation. A person who had been a slave, dependent on others and unable to go wherever they wish, becomes a free person who is independent of others and is able to go anywhere. So agitation, something that's not your choice, is kind of forcing you to do things and be engaged and be busy and involved. And so agitation, feels like you're a slave of something. And finally, this other thing in you, you're independent of. You're not caught by it. Freedom from doubt is visualized as a person with many possessions and much wealth who manages to travel through a desert to safety with no loss in property. So doubt somehow is like being in the desert. It's a dangerous place. If you're caught in doubt, you don't act, you don't protect things, you don't take care of things, you just don't know what to do, I guess. And so to finally be free from this being lost in the desert. So I don't know if those, these are ancient similes, so I don't know if these work for you, but the principle I'm trying to pass on here was that Buddha used the act of imagination and to try to evoke that for people. And there's kind of two general types of imagination that Buddha used, or pointed to, the acts of imagination that he used different words to describe. One are the ones that are, I like to call recollective, is to recollect something that is from your world that you somehow have a connection to, so it's evoking something you're already familiar with. Hopefully none of you have been a slave or been in prison, but it's unfortunately part of our wider world. And we've had examples, maybe read about such things, we know about such things exist. So it's recollecting something we've learned about in some ways. The other form of imagination is inventive. And that is, it doesn't really have much to do with the real world, except in terms of fantasy. And one imagines things. So the recollective one that's used beneficial has many purposes, and I'll offer you one purpose for Dharma practice through another act of imagination. The recollective imagination is to help the heart sing. Does your heart sing? I haven't. Let me hear. It's a metaphor for something that I think for some of us kind of just feels like there's a delight, a joy, a lightness, a kind of freedom of expression from our hearts. What a great thing for the heart to be this way. And so this opening, this kind of delight, so it makes the heart smile. It's also, again, an act of imagination. Versus the ones that feel like burdens, that feel like having heavy weight on your shoulders, that feels like the world is closing in on you. And the inventive ones, the ones where we kind of construct some kind of fantasy that is not really part of the real world, is where we often get in trouble. So delusions of grandeur, that I'm better than everyone else or better than those people. And that I think many people are, one way or other, are easy enough to fall into. And that would be inventive, because it's creating something which doesn't really exist in the real world, in the real non-human world, in the non-inventive world. And that is, it's a comparison with other people. Delusion of grandeur is in contrast to other people. I'm going to save everyone in the world. And that's just an invention of the mind that is usually a burden for other people too. So what are the stories of imagination that we project on ourselves that diminishes us? So we imagine ourselves as being worse than others. We imagine ourselves to be inadequate. We imagine ourselves to be somehow, something or other. It was so bad for me when I was quite young. When I was, in college, first year or two of college, that the only relief I could get sometimes was to imagine that I was invisible to everybody. And so I'd go through campus kind of imagining no one could see me. And that was an act of imagination that gave me some relief, because the alternative was so worse. That I was constantly comparing myself as being less than, worse than, terrible, or something. I was somehow wrong. And I didn't have to have a reason to be a wrong person. I was just inherently wrong. So, it was relatively simple fantasy to have, because it didn't require any proof. And so it turns out that this famous teaching that Buddhism has about there is the fantasy way in which it's presented, as I say that carefully, as a fantasy, it's a misunderstanding, is that Buddha teaches there is no self. Have you heard that idea? He actually didn't teach it that way. But what he did teach repeatedly is the use of the word imagine, manyati, that if you, to imagine what's me, what's myself, and who I really am, that is a problem. Don't imagine yourself as a certain kind of self, don't imagine yourself as possessing certain qualities and activities. Don't imagine that you are building yourself up in a particular way. So the one of the main thrusts of this teachings is not to deny the self. It's also not in any kind of way to build the self up, to invent the self with the imagination. Don't imagine it. And we have plenty of help in imagining a self. There's people, in the advertisement industry who are paid a tremendous amount of money to trick us into imagining ourselves in one way or the other. Imagining we're inadequate in some ways and we become adequate if we, have a different color lipstick. And so we're being fed this kind of into the imagination constantly. I think politicians do it. Sometimes the imagination is used to demonize the enemy or demonize people who are the opposition. And they're using our capacity for imagination to construct, to invent the other in a way that's deleterious. And so this thing about imagining a self, imagining the self of others, is such a dangerous thing. The internalized imagination that other people project, racism that sometimes is an imagination that's projected on people, and then some people then internalize it. Some people adopt it, they believe it, on both sides of the racism divide. And it's an act of imagination. It's an invention of some kind of concept idea that then unfortunately has a tremendous reality in how people treat each other. And so the teachings around self and non-self has a lot to do with don't imagine a self. And as we learn to notice this inventive way in which the mind has these ideas, fantasies, condemnations, ideas of who I am, what I'm supposed to be, what I am in relationship with other people, who I am that other people see me. As we kind of have fantasies sometimes as compensation for a lot of suffering we have, some of the delusion of grandeur is a compensation. Or delusion, maybe not delusions of grandeur, but delusions of fantasies of, wonderful things. How often are sexual fantasies about sex, and how much is it about some kind of compensation for just feeling inadequate and trying to fantasize some wonderful situation where it's kind of like a utopia or of a connection and with someone else. So part of what we do in mindfulness is, in fact, to start becoming sensitive and aware of how this constructive, imaginary use of the mind operates. And it might help to appreciate that there are useful ways of using the imagination and there are really harmful ways of using it. And because if it's just imagination that's kind of pushed away, like the way it was when I was a new student, then part of you is kind of a healthy part of our human functioning is not included in the practice. But maybe there's an appropriate way to use the imagination to bring us to a time and place where we are free of it. To use imagination to inspire us to practice. To use the imagination to feel or sense where the opening is to greater peace and greater settledness and greater freedom. And we use it only to the extent that it's helpful. We don't try to use it as a sledgehammer to break through the door to the other side. Like desperately trying to do something. We use it to say, I'm desperate. Now let me imagine that my breathing is like a soft massage, and I'm going to massage my desperation. I've used, I love water. I've been out, I grew up in a culture where we're close to the water, on the water a lot. And so the idea of the waves brushing up against the sand beach is such a welcome homecoming for me. So to sit in meditation, imagine the breathing as like waves coming and going up on the sand. And then if I feel, something's really hard for me to be with, then to imagine that's with those waves washing over allows me to stay present for the difficulty and keep it really simple. It's just a nice way of using imagination. Helps me to be with difficulty rather than just kind of restless and agitated about it. I also, partly I think because of how much time I spent on the water, there's something about water going off into the horizon and then the sky and the space that goes up forever, that I feel very, sometimes in meditation, I'll imagine with my eyes closed that I'm looking out into the deep universe, the dark, deep universe, kind of spaciously going out to know. And for me, because of my background, that is a really comforting image. I think for some people it wouldn't be that way, but for me it's just like, it actually helps me feel at home in this universe. And when I was a little kid, like 8, 9 years old, and laying in bed, I would kind of just spontaneously, I would have this sense that I was looking out into the universe, and I was home. And so to this day, occasionally, if I find myself kind of, my mind is a little bit kind of not cooperating, and it just doesn't seem like it's a big deal. It's not like I have to go do some deep looking at my mind. Just, okay, it's enough. Let me just kind of look into the universe now with my eyes closed. And then things get peaceful and quiet for me. It's an act of imagination. So how do you use your imagination? I think that probably most of you do. And if you don't realize that, there's a danger that often your imagination is using you in ways that don't support you, that gives you, projects into the future fantasies and ideas of the future, that, it's all going to be catastrophe thinking. Or we use our imagination to reconstruct the past. And I've certainly done that, held some kind of resentment or annoyance towards someone because, I had imagined what really happened, only to find out later when I talked to the person, it was nothing like I had imagined. Nothing. And I had this, annoyance, irritation or something, or towards someone that had no basis in reality. Isn't that embarrassing? I said, wow, this mind of mine, it has this capacity to, to imagine a past that never was there, and I live as if it did. Luckily, nowadays, I know to always check. I've learned very well what my mind is able to construct, and I can see it happening now. And this is one of the gifts of meditation, is to really to be able to be present enough to watch thoughts, images, ideas arise in the mind, and track it and see it well enough to understand what it is and not be fooled by it. To put a question mark next to it and say, well, maybe, let's go check it out. Let me ask the person. And, when you said the other day we were together, you said, you're pretty lousy. Is that what you said? Or maybe I'd say it better. When we were together last time, as I left, you said something I couldn't quite hear you. I'm a little bit hard of hearing, which is true. And, what did you say? So that's a nice way of saying it, right? Oh, I said you're lovely. And so, I was living in a fantasy and what that meant and story about what, how they were treating me and all the different wrongs that's happened to me. So I hope that this talk, it'd be nice if it inspired you, but I hope this talk evokes a curiosity and an interest for you in how you live in the world of imagination. And how can it be done in a way that supports you in your life and helps you in a healthy, appropriate way? And how is it that the imagination is not helpful? How does it a burden? How does it kind of put you in prison? How does it limit your life? How does it really weigh you down? And for the Buddha, one of the kind of gathering points for a lot of burden, a lot of suffering, is all the ways that all the imagination that's used to construct, to invent a sense of self, an idea of self. And you don't have to be too concerned about this idea that there's not supposed to be any self. But when you do Dharma practice, you are supposed to be concerned about how we are inventing a self, imagining a self, and become more and more wise about how this works. And then the wonderful spiritual question is, who are you when you're not imagining who you are? Then who are you? Or to say it even more powerful, I think, who are you when you don't answer that question with a thought? Then who? And even better, probably, from a Buddhist point of view, is not who are you, but what is here? What is left here when you're not imagining? What is here is left when you don't use thoughts to tell you? Because even this innocent use of who are you might actually limit something powerful. And when you don't let that limit you, then what? What is here? What manifests itself? What flows? What comes? So use your imagination well. Thank you. So we have a couple of minutes, and if anyone wants to ask a question or a comment, and then when I finish here, those of you who want to come with me out to the parking lot afterwards, we can have a conversation out there with our masks off, and just continue this or something else. But yes, anyone now wants to say anything?
When talking about this imagination, especially for the future, I tend to think of it as planning, right? And I think as long as I don't get attached to the one way of possible future, right? Then I think there's nothing, I don't see anything wrong with it, right? Like, I also can imagine several possible futures and probable futures and improbable futures. And if I'm not attached to, say, what I thought was probable future, like in your case, you thought this person going to say this, but they said that. I'm not seeing it as a way of kind of like something wrong I did and I should stop doing that. And instead, I say, I just shouldn't be attaching myself to this, what I thought was probable future.
Yes.
But there's nothing wrong with it. I don't see like why, that's why I think seeing things clearly, right, and not imagining it. We have limited set of words here, like English is a kind of funny language.
To be present here and now wisely includes being aware of the future and what might happen, and includes what happened in the past. The present moment here and now doesn't have to exclude a concern for the past and the present. And that's a wise part of life, to plan ahead, to think ahead, and imagine what might happen, and prepare for contingency plans. Bring the umbrella, or something. And my life, I have a very full life, and so I need to take time to think in the future. This is what's going to happen. This is happening, and okay, if I'm going to do them, I better do some things now first and get ready, and let's organize things and set up and like people like in my career, Dharma teachers like me, we often have to plan 2 years in advance. So everything can be done, everything works and coordinated with everybody else. So I can show up and tell people to be in the present.
That's great.
So behind you.
So I have a question regarding contemplative practice in general, because in other religions, their prayers, it's a form of contemplative practice, but in Buddhism, we have meditation, we have different lineage, right, different traditions. But what to you is the key difference between this contemplative practice and others? And there's some framework, like taking in some sort of faith-based practice in other religion.
Keep it close to your mouth.
Is the key difference is whether you talk about emergence, basically be there and see things emerge, right? Don't limit yourself to one possibility. But there are other religious people who follow the, who, sorry, the key difference to some people say the key difference is whether you allow that emergence or that contemplative practice lead you to open-mindedness, or you are enforcing your own belief, right, which could be problematic for the world. So I think the broader question is, what's unique about this practice and this contemplative practice versus others? And why is it better? Or maybe it's not better. Or
thank you. I think it's a reasonable and a good question, but I'm not really qualified to talk about other people's practices. And I'm certainly not interested in talking about it in a way that makes one better than the other. I think different religions have a whole world system, a whole philosophy or view of life and logic, that things make sense in their worldview, in their kind of whole thing. And so you ask, what is the purpose? And are you that purpose that they want to, that they're offering, and that worldview that purpose is within, does that work for me? So in Buddhism, we have a kind of a worldview. We have a purpose within that worldview, and I don't think necessarily has to work for everybody else. But so you have to, and then learn. And so if you're interested in this important question you're asking, I think it's for you to answer, really. But you have to go and study each one well enough to be able to compare and see, is it apples and oranges, or is it different kinds of apples?
sorry, the reason I asked this question is I'm trying to deal with, because my family, my husband, I'm more leaning toward this.
My hearing's hard, so you have to really, and the best thing to do, if you hold it horizontally, so it's like that, and really closely to your mouth. Yeah.
So the reason I asked that question is that it's in my own personal life, I am leaning toward this tradition and this practice, but for my family, they're Christian. They have their Christian belief, and how do I reconcile that? And how do I convince my husband to come do my practice? Because kind of someday has to be split into two. Anyway.
Yeah, how to reconcile? I imagine there's two things: is how do you reconcile the two practices, but also how do you have harmony with your family, and your kids? Yes, yeah. How are you in harmony? So this is an important question, and so there's different ways of answering your question. One is at the terms with the terms that you offered. Another way, which you didn't ask, but which is the orientation of this practice, is what's happening in you emotionally, deep down, that's the source of this question. And you don't have to answer now, but what happens if you practice with that fear or that distress? And if the fear goes away, how do you answer the question then? But if the fear remains, the answer, the rational answer to the question might not really be addressing what's deep down inside. And so the interest here with our practice is always to go deep. And what's at the depths here? And can we clarify that before we clarify some of the things that are not quite as deep? So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer for you, but that would be the approach here. And then you're in a better position to answer the question yourself. Okay. So thank you. So one announcement, and that is that it's been, for at IMC here, the pandemic, in a sense, began as something that affected us on a Saturday when we were going to have a one-day meditation retreat here. People showed up, and we'd already that evening, not before, decided we can't meet. We're quarantined now. We can't meet. So people showed up, and we sat outside here and talked for a while, and then we closed. We were closed, and that was it. And I don't think we've had a day long here for IMC since then. Anyway, we're having one of the first ones Saturday. So it's 3 years. And so Don Neal is teaching a day-long meditation retreat. I think it's on the 7 Factors of Awakening. There's right? There's a flyer. There's flyers out there on the counter. Yeah, look, beautiful flyer. And what's the time for it?
It's from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 on Saturday, January 28th.
9:30 to 4:30. And again, people are wearing masks, but you're welcome to come. And if you would like to come here, and Don's a great teacher, and so I think it should be, things were starting to open up, and people are more comfortable with all this. And I mean, I suspect that a good number of you are comfortable to be here without masks. Some of you would never come here without masks. But so for those of you who are comfortable not wearing masks, I want to thank you for wearing masks and doing it carefully. I think it's a gift, and I think it helps this kind of environment that we're in to be able to meditate in a way that makes people be able to let go more deeply. And so in a few minutes, you can take a folding chair out there in the parking lot if you want to meet. And because some of us are going to meet out there, maybe partly, if you're at all inclined, it'd be great if you turn to someone next to you and just said hello to them and welcome them. Even if this is your first time, you can welcome them. Thank you.